Hey y'all, I was going to start this video off with an apology for how long it took to put it together, but if I keep doing that, I'll be apologizing every time. It's still a series. You'll get new episodes when you get them. I'm really trying to put them out as soon as I can, but it does take kind of more work than I expected, and I'm just super happy that you tuned back in. And so I want to talk this week a little bit about the pace of change that we've seen from the protests and kind of where I'm at too. After more than 2 months of nationwide protests, there have been rippling effects throughout society. BLM got chokeholds banned in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in Denver, and after Elijah McClain's murder by police, protesters demanded and obtained commitments from mayors across the country to address and reform police restraint techniques. The cops who killed George Floyd have all been arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The cops who killed Breonna Taylor, I will say, have not been arrested. In my last video on Say Her Name, I talk about the societal forces that affect the way police perceive and interact with Black women. Check out that video for more on that topic. And of course, here in LA, protests have continued pressure on the police, sheriff's department, and mayor's office. Although we have more to do, overall, we've seen massive accomplishments by this movement. I've linked a really great article that lists out many of the triumphs of the movement and the description below. It's from CNN. I hope you'll check it out. For me personally, it's been difficult to maintain my own participation in the protests. Even with this series, it's been hard to sit down and think deeply and talk openly about subjects involving race, despite how passionately I feel about these topics. Within my family and my community, folks who have been out on the front lines feel really similarly. There's a lot of my friends and family who have been at the protests, who have seen the beatings with the billy clubs, who have seen the tear gas and experienced pepper spray. They all are kind of burnt out, and I feel really the same way. I've been experiencing feelings of dread pretty consistently, even when attending low-risk demonstrations. The incursion of federal police in Portland has really made this feeling of dread even worse. I will say I don't think it's that our enthusiasm has fallen off. It's just a matter of self-preservation for a lot of folks. Mental and physical self-preservation is key to maintaining activism and staying in the fight for the long run. And this is why I try to infuse historical context into my videos, because I think it's crucial to understand the really long timeline of racial justice and those struggles in this country. Our culture thrives on instant gratification, but that is not and has never been the pace of change. I've noticed a trend in the media and in the movement itself to expect a quick and clean resolution to the protests. For instance, the article that I mentioned, the one that I said I would link in the description, that article was written on June 13th, really during the early peak of these protests. The amount of think pieces ruminating on the effectiveness of the protests have really fallen off and dried up before the full societal impact of those protests was really going to be able to be felt and to manifest. So historical context is crucial to me because it reminds me that this is just the beginning. For instance, follow me here. The Freedom Rides. They rode through Mississippi in May of 1961. Segregated buses and terminals were prohibited 161 days later after those Freedom Rides had started. The Montgomery bus boycotts, those took place over the course of 381 days. The Emancipation Proclamation, it was issued January 1st, 1863. 94 years later, the Civil Rights Act came along in 1957. That's 34,584 days later, for those of you keeping track at home. The murder of George Floyd, which kicked off the massive protests this summer, took place on May 25th, 2020. That was just over 70 days ago, and look at all that we've accomplished. I'm doing my best to acknowledge that things take time. I'm doing my best to realize that the media and the short attention span as country are predisposed to look for the next big thing. This past week, I listened to a really powerful episode of New York Times podcast called The Daily. The podcast this week featured Sharonda Bossier. She's a Black woman, she's an activist, she's a teacher, she's the deputy director of Education Leaders of Color. Overall, she's about that life. But this interview with her was so timely for me because she really talked about her earliest formative memories on racism in this country, looking back almost 30 years from her experience as a kid in Los Angeles during the LaTosha Harlins trial and the Rodney King riots, all the way through the birth of the BLM movement, the Ferguson protests, and the 2016 campaign through today. She talked about what it feels like to be in this moment today as nationwide protests have erupted, while at the same time feeling like the movement is far behind where it could be. The New York Times reporter on that story, Caitlin Dickerson, asked her if she wishes that she had done anything differently in the early days of BLM. And Sharonda's response was, "I wish I hadn't been naive. And I wish that I had been just a little more realistic about how long change actually takes." And I took those words heavily at first. I felt wounded by the idea that even though we've gotten so many people on board with sweeping change, that change will still be slow in coming. And again, historical context. We've got to look back to 2013 to consider how far the Black Lives Matter movement has come. The movement started as a hashtag on Twitter after the acquittal of George Zimmerman. In 2014, the eyes of the world were on BLM. Public opinion was shifting and President Obama was listening. And then came November 2016, the presidential election where Donald Trump was elected. And yet, despite this administration, despite the seemingly boundless cruelty this administration has showed itself to be capable of, shown itself to really thrive in, here we are in 2020 marching in the streets, calling out the racists, tearing down the statues and the structures of bondage and oppression, putting identity politics, whataboutism, and exclusion in the trash. I look to our past and I look at us today and I am so damn proud. I encourage you to stay in the streets and to look to our accomplishments thus far for encouragement. But I also encourage you to practice self-care and to practice patience with yourself and others. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.